All right, well, welcome today. We are going to be talking about the future and the future of rain specifically. My name is Liz Harvey Roberts. I am the Chief Development Officer here in California, and I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you for taking your lunch hour, and I hope that you are enjoying lunch while you're listening and participating in this presentation. We are really, really grateful that Daniel Swain is with us. He is a fellow with the Nature Conservancy, a climate fellow. He is an expert in all things climate, weather related, and we're going to be enjoying listening and learning from him today. If any of you are LA Times readers, I've been enjoying reading a quote from Daniel every day for the past probably 3 months. So he's very well equipped to speak to everything climate related, and he is an expert that is called on frequently. So I am a California native. I've worked for the Conservancy for 13 years. They've all been great. And I'm a person that grew up with drought. So I'm a part of the bucket brigade. I have buckets in my showers and buckets outside capturing rainwater. And I'm just used to kind of the wax and wane of rainwater and precipitation. And so I know things are accelerating and changing even during my lifetime, and I look forward to hearing from Daniel a little bit about why that is. I'm also very excited that Katrin Chappell is joining us today. She is the Associate Director of TNC's California Water Program, and she's going to be responding and giving a little bit more color about the Nature Conservancy and what we're doing here in California and beyond to respond to these changes. So welcome very much, and I am going to now just turn it over to Daniel so that you can introduce yourself, say a little bit more about your background, and we'll get to it. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen now, which you're going to see my desktop, and then I'm quickly going to pull up my slides, leave it here. Hopefully, and momentarily, everybody will see it full screen, and then we'll get started. I'll assume it's showing up as it's supposed to, as long as I don't hear otherwise. So thanks everyone for joining. I have an unusual role that is supported by UCLA, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and then of course the Nature Conservancy of California. And it's an unusual role because I am a practicing climate scientist, but I also have the ability, the privilege really, of spending a lot of time having conversations with different audiences. So in other words, being a scientist communicator. And I distinguish that from being only a scientist or only a science communicator because it means that I truly do get to have a foot in both worlds. And I do split my time almost half and half. So I do engage in the production of new research. But I also spend the other half of my time having conversations with diverse audiences throughout California, especially, but also elsewhere, all the way from in the public policy world, the emergency management world, the ecological management world, and elsewhere. So it kind of gives me an opportunity to have really interesting conversations with a lot of really interesting people almost constantly. Sometimes it's a bit overwhelming. If you ever email me, in the past couple of weeks, you might have seen a rather lengthy auto response with different instructions for different kinds of people and collaborators who really want to engage. But I do think in the long run, that's a good problem to have. And it's a problem that I only have in terms of people wanting to engage so much because I'm lucky enough to have this unusual, but I think really effective arrangement, which is partially funded by the Nature Conservancy. And split across different kinds of institutions, public, NGO, and otherwise. So without further ado, I do want to talk about the weather and the climate as well. And just for perspective, when I say I'm a climate scientist, that actually means in my case that I have a background in atmospheric science and meteorology. So originally a weather scientist, but I got into climate science and climate change from that angle. And so my perspective on climate and climate change is largely from I guess you could call it a weather and aggregate perspective, because of course it's the same atmosphere operating under the same physics and the same laws of chemistry whether or not you're talking about weather or climate. It's just a matter of timescale. So with that in mind, let's consider the timescale a little bit, just as a very brief primer. California's climate, of course, is highly variable to begin with. And I think the most obvious way to envision this is to think about our typical seasonality of California precipitation. So, of course, anybody who's lived in California for any more than a few years realizes that it generally doesn't rain in the summer, and it usually rains and in the mountains snows in winter. And of course, there are some exceptions. The southeastern deserts and the mountainous areas do get some summertime precipitation occasionally. But in general, most of California, particularly the heavily populated areas along the urban corridors in the San Francisco Bay Area and in the Los Angeles and Orange County areas, it generally is wet in the winter and dry in the summer, with some amount of transition seasons in the autumn and the spring in between. And it turns out that seasonality is kind of unusual in a US context, and even more so globally, because we have what's known as a Mediterranean-like climate, meaning that the climate resembles somewhat that of the Mediterranean basin in Europe, where there is relatively little precipitation in the summer and a lot of precipitation in relative terms in the winter. But this is an unusual setup, and it's the only place, in fact, in North America that has a wet winter, dry summer configuration. Almost anywhere else you go, there is at least some summer rainfall. And what that means is that California is uniquely susceptible to perturbations to our weather patterns during winter, because that's really the only time of year when we have a realistic prospect of seeing meaningful precipitation. I'm generalizing a little bit, but this is often true in a pretty literal sense. The other thing that's unusual about California climate is the variation in precipitation from year to year is also uniquely high in a North American context. That's something you can see in the map on the right. The colors in California for the coefficient of variation are very different than anywhere else in the entire country. And what this means is that we have more year-to-year variability of precipitation than essentially anywhere else in North America, and arguably more than most other places in the world. And that is what makes us susceptible to severe multi-year droughts, because it is possible for us to have multiple years in a row with very low precipitation in a place that is the rest of the time actually pretty wet. So it's one thing to be in a desert where it's always dry, but in California, more often than not, we actually see quite wet conditions during winter. And yet we can see bone dry conditions every once in a while, and sometimes those years line up one after the other. So all of this is to say, California has unusually wide swings between wet and dry on different timescales, season to season, year to year, and then even month to month, sometimes during the wet season. And all of this is because we sort of exist at a climatic transition zone between much more active mid-latitude climate to the north and a much more stable quiescent climate, subtropical climate to the south. And we're sort of on that dividing line. Sometimes that dividing line exists somewhere in California, where Northern California is quite active and wet, and Southern California is quiescent and dry. And that dividing line is dynamic. It's not static in time, but it shifts around from season to season, as you might imagine. It's farther north in summer. That's why California is dry then, and farther south in winter, which is why California sees its wet season during the cool months. It also shifts around from year to year. In the wet years, as you might expect, that dividing line between the mid-latitude climate and the drier subtropical climate is farther south. That might be during, for example, El Nino years. In drier years, perhaps La Nina years, that dividing line is typically farther to the north of California for the most part. So this is one of the basic reasons why California has, from the outset, a highly variable hydroclimate. But even places that already are susceptible to a lot of variability could potentially see even more variability. And this is something that we really see jumping out at us in a warming climate, which is to say that even though California already has a lot of variability from year to year, season to season, and month to month, we expect there to be even more variability on all of those timescales as the climate continues to warm, even though we don't necessarily expect there to be a large change in the overall average precipitation. In fact, we don't really know whether California's overall average precipitation may decrease or increase a little bit And that comes as a surprise, I think, to a lot of folks. But even in a much, much warmer world with very aggressive warming scenarios, it remains somewhat unclear whether California's precipitation on average would increase or decrease. Probably wouldn't do much of either way. But does that mean that California precipitation won't change in a warming climate? Absolutely not. In fact, the opposite is essentially true, where we find dramatic shifts in California precipitation that, in the mean, cancel each other out a bit. So we foresee an increase in both very wet years, like the one we're currently experiencing, and very dry years, like we've seen 3 or 4 times in the past decade. And I mentioned those two things in the real world on purpose, because what the net increase we see then is an increase in what we like to call precipitation whiplash or hydroclimate whiplash, this notion that we're going increasingly rapidly back and forth between one extreme and the other on opposite ends of the spectrum in a way that isn't captured if we only look at changes in the average precipitation, which indeed has not really changed in the past century in California, despite the fact that we've seen a growing number of extremes on both the dry and the wet end of the spectrum. And I think there's plenty of ways to visualize this. And actually, this slide, I originally had this slide with 2 panels on the left, just September 2015 and then February 2017 on the left, going from Lake Oroville being extremely low during a historically severe drought to having the near disaster at Oroville Dam because of way too much water coming out of it during an infrastructure failure in early 2017. I then added the 3rd panel because we went right back to historic drought just a few years later in 2021. And this latest panel on the far right was added in the past week by the Nature Conservancy team, just to illustrate the fact that we've now swung back yet again. So this is less than a decade of imagery from the same place in Northern California, in a hydrologically and ecologically really important region. And we've just swung from the pendulum back and forth already with 2 full cycles in less than 10 years, and broke a lot of records and caused a lot of problems along the way. So this is illustrative of the kind of changes that I'm talking about when I talk about increasing precipitation or increasing hydroclimate whiplash in a warming climate. And just as if we needed further motivation, some examples from Southern California, where in late 2017, what was then the largest fire in modern California history destroyed over 1,000 structures and burned over 300,000 acres in December, very late season. But then this was immediately followed by a catastrophic flash flood and debris flow event in the fire zone just a few weeks later in January 2018. These were the devastating debris flows in Montecito in Santa Barbara County. And yet, during this period, if you only take the average of the conditions, it was essentially mostly sunny and breezy most of the time, which doesn't really capture either of these historically significant and hugely disruptive and even deadly extremes that occurred in the meantime. So if we focus only on averages, I think it's pretty clear at this point that we're really going to miss the point a lot of the time. So what's causing this increase? And let me just take a moment to see, I don't know if anybody is seeing this banner across the top that's blocking the titles, but I'm just going to see if I can hide that. There we go. I don't know if anybody else could see that, but I could. So now it's out of my way, and now I'm confident no one else is seeing it either. So what's going on physically? Why are we seeing and expecting to see even more of an increase in hydroclimate whiplash? Really, what we find is that this really comes down to basic thermodynamics and this notion of I guess you could call it an expanding atmospheric sponge. And I use this analogy because it's kind of literal. In fact, last summer, we did this experiment with a TV crew where we actually bought some comically oversized novelty sponges and soaked up increasingly large amounts of water to illustrate this fact. And in fact, using actual sponges, you can visualize this pretty well, because what's going on is that the water vapor holding potential of the atmosphere increases exponentially for a linear warming. So in other words, for each additional degree of warming, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor increases by a larger absolute increment than the last degree of warming. So in other words, it's like compound interest in the bank, except the interest rate is about 7% per degree centigrade of warming, or in Fahrenheit, about 4% per degree Fahrenheit. I know most of us would be pretty happy with 4 or 7% interest in a bank in terms of interest and growth of your savings these days. But when it comes to the atmosphere and its capacity to hold water vapor, this can actually result in major challenges. And one thing that's obvious is why this might result in an increase on the wet side. Because, of course, if you have 15% more capacity to hold water vapor with, say, 2 degrees centigrade of warming, or nearly 4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, that suggests that your precipitation extremes are going to be at least 15% larger. And actually, research shows that you get an even larger increase in the actual precipitation extremes than the scaling with the water vapor. But the other thing that happens, which is maybe a little bit less intuitive, but is equally important, is on the other side of the hydrologic spectrum, on the dry side. So not only have you increased the ceiling on how intense precipitation events can become, but you've also increased the ceiling on how intense evaporation rates can become, and therefore the potential intensity and the rapid development of droughts, as well as floods. And so this relatively simple sponge analogy explains a lot of what's going on. And I think we've neglected the dry side of the sponge analogy for quite some time, because it really does help explain why California is seeing climate amplified droughts and why the ongoing Colorado River crisis is as bad as it is. It's essentially for this reason. So this leads to more intense droughts. And I'm just pointing out what this looks like in the broader context. This is for the Colorado River Basin, for the southwestern states. And as you can see, over time, there's really been a pretty minimal decrease in the overall average precipitation, but a dramatic increase in temperature, and also a dramatic increase in the severity and frequency of droughts. You can see that in the panel on the far right, where more negative numbers means more drought-like conditions. And again, this is really illustrating the fact that drought and hydroclimate variability isn't just a question of precipitation. Precipitation is, of course, a critical half, but it is only half, and the other half is evaporation. And there, temperatures are playing an increasingly important role in a warming climate. But I did want to focus more on the wet side, because it's something that is in the news a lot recently, that's for sure. And one of the reasons why we are expecting such a large increase in precipitation whiplash and also flood risk in a warming California is that the exponential increase in the atmosphere's ability to hold water vapor essentially implies that we're going to see more intense and stronger atmospheric river storms, which can produce potentially more extreme precipitation. And some of you may already be familiar with what atmospheric rivers are, but for those who aren't, just a brief definition. These are elongated and very long, sometimes thousands of miles long, long but also narrow plumes of highly concentrated atmospheric water vapor that bring California arguably most of its water. Most of our winter storms, the ones that bring a lot of rain and snow, are at least in some form an atmospheric river. So they're both a blessing and a curse, depending on the context. If we didn't have them, California would have a very different, much drier climate and a much more arid ecology. So they sort of help shape California into the verdant green landscape that much of it is today. But also, they are responsible for the vast majority of damaging floods in California. Something like 99% of all flood damages in California came from atmospheric rivers. And what we're finding is that it's the very most extreme and most disruptive atmospheric rivers that are going to increase the most in a warming climate, potentially even at the expense of the more moderate beneficial ones, which help primarily bolster our water supply without causing a lot of harm. And in that was sort of the basis for these discoveries, are sort of the basis for us to concoct a new extreme storm scenario for the state of California. This is something we've been working with for several years now. It's called the Arc Storm 2.0 scenario. It's an update of an old extreme flood contingency scenario for the state of California. But for the purposes here, what I really want to focus on is the idea that this is a weeks-long scenario involving 10 or 15 consecutive storm events over about 30 days. So it's nearly 30 days and 30 nights of rain. It would be a big deal. And we designed this scenario in this way because we realize that it's not so much the big one-off storms that pose the greatest threat from a flood perspective in California, but it's the sequences, these multi-week sequences of progressively stronger events that cause the most problems. And we've gotten a bit of a taste of that actually this year with what's transpired since December. But just for some context here, these are the kinds of precipitation totals we're talking about. And there were actually two scenarios that were part of ArcStorm 2.0. One, a lesser historical scenario in a cooler climate, and the other, a much more extreme scenario in a warmer future 21st century climate. And of course, these scenarios are really quite different from each other because in the future, there is dramatically more precipitation, more extreme rainfall that occurs throughout essentially all of California than in the historical scenario. But just to give you a sense of magnitude, the red areas on the map on the right especially are places where over the course of 30 days, more than 70 inches of precipitation occurs. And at lower elevations, that is 70 plus inches of rain in 30 days. It is a phenomenal amount of water that falls in these scenarios. And we know that these are not off-the-wall ridiculous numbers because they are comparable, though perhaps slightly larger, than what occurred during the Great Flood of 1862. So there is a historical example that predates most of modern California's infrastructure and major urban development, but is nonetheless gives us a perspective that these numbers aren't totally off base. And this is something that really could happen, especially in a warming climate. Just for some recent historical context, since a lot of folks have been asking, how big were the recent storm sequences in the context of these scenarios that we've developed in the past few years? Well, between December and January 2022, 2023, which was sort of the peak of the flooding so far this year in California, we got to about 80% of the statewide accumulated precipitation during the weaker historical ArcStorm scenario. But we really only got about halfway over that 30-day period to the kind of precipitation we would be looking at in the more extreme Arc Future scenario. So in other words, we really can't use this year's events to tell us what the conditions would be on the ground during the plausible large flood events of the future, because quite frankly, they would be much worse than what we just experienced. And it's not just a matter of the total quantity of precipitation I mentioned, but it's also a matter of the phase change. In other words, the change from snow in the high elevation locations to rain. And a lot of folks worry about rain on snow events. In other words, warm rains that melt snow. And that is probably going to be a growing concern in a warming climate. But here I'm referring to the even larger effect that even if there is no snow on the ground to melt in a given location, if it used to snow there and now it's raining, well, you just have that much more runoff to deal with in the short term because all of that water is entering watersheds immediately rather than being stored as conveniently in the snowpack, which can melt at some later point when the storm isn't actively precipitating. That used to be the historical model where snow would fall and then melt later in the season, replenishing watersheds and aquifers throughout the spring and summer months. But increasingly in the future, we expect this precipitation to fall as rain rather than snow at increasingly high elevations. And yes, we do find that climate change is increasing the likelihood of an extreme storm sequence somewhat larger than what we saw this year. I think it stands to reason that climate change has also increased the likelihood of an event comparable to what we have seen this year. But we haven't actually done the specific research on that one yet. So I think all of this brings about some interesting questions, and it sounds a little bit doom and gloomy, but what can we do about this? How do we manage this increase in extremes on both ends of the hydroclimate spectrum, wet but also dry? And I think that there are a lot of good examples of things that have been done in California that could be replicated or scaled up in other places. And, I don't know anybody if you've ever driven on Interstate 80 between the San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento, you've gone over what's known as the causeway. Well, what is the body of water that the causeway is going over? It's the Yolo bypass. And the Yolo bypass is an interesting and pretty innovative, I would say, solution to reducing flood risk in Sacramento, which is thought to be one of the most flood vulnerable cities in all of North America. This bypass essentially is a region that is designated as being a place that can be safely inundated during high flow events on the Sacramento River. There are weirs upstream, essentially intentional low points on the levee system where water can flow over and enter the bypass and essentially take pressure off the critical levees that protect Sacramento. And in the bypass, there is some light agriculture that is amenable to periodic inundation, but it also provides a nice pop-up wetland habitat right along the Pacific Flyway. And so in reducing urban flood risk, this is the kind of intervention that sort of lets the water do its thing, expanding floodplains on a pop-up as necessary basis in a way that is sort of win-win because it protects urban areas. It adds pop-up wetland habitats in places where they're critically needed. And, it really has been successful so far in the past decades in protecting Sacramento. This is the kind of thinking I think that we need to engage in moving forward, about being flexible. And rather than trying to build ever taller walls to contain ever increasing floodwaters, being more circumspect and increasingly thinking about how we can, quote unquote, let the water do its thing. And this is what the YOLO bypass looks like from above during a high flow event. It looks like a giant flood, but the good news is that whole area was designed to accommodate flooding. This is the river reclaiming part of its natural floodplain in a way that is not harmful to the Sacramento, which you can see the skyline in the background. My hope is that we can do these sorts of projects on larger scales on other river systems in California, but also on smaller scales, because there isn't always room to do a big project like this in a place that has more development. So in those kinds of contexts, in highly urbanized contexts, there are also opportunities to do things on a smaller scale that nonetheless have a similarly positive impact on both the ecology and the environment of a region and in reducing risk to humans and society and infrastructure in populated areas. And so there are a number of nature conservancy projects that are aimed at doing just that, that are really, you could say, commensurate with the climate that we expect to see in the 21st century in California. And there are some great specific examples of this. I was down with nature conservancy folks on the Santa Clara River just a few months ago in between flood events this winter, immediately following a significant flood event. During those events, I mentioned in the precipitation in early January, and it's flooded again since then. We got lucky. We were out there on some gorgeous sunny days, but it was really great to see that the river, the braided river channel was within some bounds, was able to do its thing. It looked like a braided river behaving as it should hydrologically. And there were some great examples of the river actually redepositing sediments in places where it needed to go to help redevelop floodplains. There are other nature conservancy examples on very different kinds of river systems. Of course, the Navarro River, a very different ecological and geographic setting than the Santa Clara River in Southern California. But here again, seeing the difference of what these conditions are under low flow conditions, where there's barely a trickle, where the river channel may have even gone dry, and how dramatically different that looks under high flow conditions, thinking about how to leverage this variability to achieve multiple benefits on the ecological side and on the flood risk reduction side, but also on the groundwater storage side, because of course, remember, we will also be seeing more severe droughts. Another example from the Sacramento River, where once again, there are some win-win kinds of strategies where you can increasingly expand the floodplains closer to what they would have looked like before human interventions, while also increasingly doing a good job of protecting essentially the towns and the settlements that you don't want to flood during a high flow event. Again and again, examples of nature conservancy projects, both from Northern and Southern California, that are achieving these kinds of multiple benefits, which range from ecological restoration, groundwater recharge, and also in many cases reductions in flood risk in places we really don't want to get inundated. So I'll have a few closing thoughts before I pass it off to someone who can talk a little bit more about the specifics of some of these TNC projects I was just mentioning. But really, I think the most important thing to remember is that climate change has arrived. This is no longer a prediction regarding the future, but it's an observable reality in our present. And I think folks who are perceptive and who have been in California the last decade really get this on a personal and visceral level. I increasingly talk to folks who really just say, look, you really just have to look out the window. In a warming California, it is going to be both drier and wetter in different years and in different seasons due to increasing hydroclimate whiplash. And I think this is a bit different than the perception that California is just going to get perpetually drier. There will be worse droughts, but we'll also see even wetter conditions at other times. And so the net result, of course, is more severe droughts, but also more severe floods. And we don't want to too myopically focus just on one or the other. If we're going to effectively and equitably co-manage the risks of both water scarcity and overabundance. And I think it does make sense to talk about co-management because addressing them individually is really only looking at one side of the coin. And nature-based solutions really are pretty key to adapting to this new climate reality because increasingly it's consistent with this idea that we need to be more flexible. And the best way to be flexible is to, in a lot of ways, let the water do its thing when it wants to do its thing, with some bounds to keep people safe and to make sure that we don't have bad outcomes. And there are a number of existing nature conservancy projects and other proposed ones that are consistent with the kind of expectation about the climate that we're likely to see and that we're already starting to see in a warming California. So there really is a need, a great need, to deeply integrate these sorts of nuanced climate information into planning and decision-making and ongoing and future proposed nature conservancy projects. I think this is really going to be key in staying ahead of the curve. And it really gives an advantage, I think, to those folks who incorporate it because otherwise you're working from behind the curve. And with that, I think I'm going to go back to some of the imagery of these conservancy projects, just because it's so fascinating to talk about how these have evolved in the context of what we've seen recently and what the future holds for these projects and for projects like them. So I'll leave it on the screen for now.
Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everybody. I'm Katrin Chappelle, and I oversee our California water work related to managing California's rivers and our landscapes to improve conditions for freshwater biodiversity, but also help manage some of the events that Daniel described to be less impactful on people. So I just want to say it's been incredible. I've been working on water issues in California for over a decade and known of Daniel's work throughout that time, and watching him transition from predictions to talking about what's happening right in front of us really drives home the urgency of the work that TNC and other organizations are doing to adapt to this changed climate. So I'm going to spend about 2 minutes talking about some of our projects specifically, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So as folks who know about the Nature Conservancy, our goal is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And so you may be asking yourselves as you listen to Daniel's talk, what does this new climate reality mean for not just people, but for nature? So backing up a little bit where Daniel's talk started, California's ecosystems actually adapted already to a highly variable climate. As Daniel said, California has always had this variability. It's always had droughts and it's always had floods. So our ecosystems are adapted to that. But what they're not adapted to is the intensity of these extreme events, specifically extreme droughts. Nature actually fares pretty well during flood years. You can see right now in the news stories of rivers coming back to life, even lakes that once were coming back, that once were kind of coming back onto the landscapes. What is more impactful to biodiversity specifically, and to some of the species that we are trying to protect at the Nature Conservancy, like California salmon populations, are the extended droughts and the very, very dry and hot conditions that have had incredible impacts on our rivers and all the species that rely on them. And then it's us humans and the infrastructure that we've developed that have the biggest challenges during flood years. So TNC has two different approaches to protecting nature and creating a sustainable future for people under this new climate reality. So during droughts, when we're thinking about what we want to do, how we want to restore rivers or protect the species that rely on them, our goal is to return flows to rivers and wetlands and other landscapes that protect nature against drought impacts. And this involves working with landowners specifically to change how and when they use their water to return those flows to rivers and streams that are important for biodiversity. Our goal is to permanently rededicate some of the flows that humans have been using back into our rivers and streams so that it reduces the pressure on river health, but it also creates a more sustainable water budget for people. Our goal is for these rivers to have the flows that they need to reverse the extinction crisis that we're seeing in California, but also make sure people's water supply is more realistic and reliable. So in a place like the Santa Clara River, like you're seeing a picture of here, that means working with the landowners and the water users in that watershed to reduce the amount of water that they're pumping out of that watershed and using during drought years. And then on the flip side, for the flood years, the second approach is to use nature-based solutions to protect communities from floods and to capture more of the rainfall that's coming during those years to replenish our groundwater basins. So the Nature Conservancy has projects in both rural and urban communities aimed at restoring natural function to our landscapes. So that means things like removing concrete in cities where we can use more natural landscapes to filter rainwater, stormwater capture, improve water quality. And it also, in this picture here that you're seeing in the Santa Clara, means allowing more flooding onto fields and agriculture that need it during that can allow that during those specific wet years. Our flood protection system itself could also benefit from being naturified, is what I say. So as Daniel said, we need to give rivers more room to expand and contract during these whiplash conditions. So we are working closely with communities around the state to build buffers and change the way we build levees to create more natural processes that make the ecosystem thrive even more during these flood years and protect communities. So the Nature Conservancy is at the forefront of demonstrating these types of solutions, but at the same time, we're also pushing policies at the local, state, and federal level to incentivize this type of investment and help us adapt to California's new precipitation. It takes organizations like the Nature Conservancy pushing people who are making decisions about what's being built and where it's being built to make the case for these multi-benefit and nature-based solutions. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing in the California Water Program. So with that, I'm going to pause because I'm like seeing all the numbers blow up in the chat and the Q&A and pass it to Liz. And I think both Daniel and I have some time to answer your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Katrin. Thank you, Daniel. And you're right, things are blowing up in our chat. I just love how everybody's so active with their questions and also how you're chatting with each other to answer some of them. So that's awesome. So I've got many questions to choose from, and we're not going to be able to get to them all. And we would love to address them in the future after this presentation. I'm just going to put something out there that if any of you would like a Daniel Swain 2.0, please let us know. We're interested in what you would like to hear about in the future, and we could have, the future of rain 2.0. So if that's of interest, let us know. Okay, so we have a lot of questions about natural climate solutions. What can we expect really moving forward about how nature can help us be durable through all these kind of extreme conditions? How is nature faring with all of this rain? Is it really faring pretty well? Is this harmful to nature, plants and wildlife, or is it actually benefiting from it?
Thanks, Liz. Like I said, that most of what, evolved in California, most of our natural species evolved with this evolved to be able to thrive in both dry and wet conditions. This is, a very, very wet year, and there's definitely likely some, impacts happening to some of our species just because it's, they haven't seen it in a while, especially with 3 years of drought right before it. But when we're looking specifically at like freshwater biodiversity, so then species that rely on freshwater and the amount of extinctions that we're seeing in that group over the past decade or two, and we expect to see over the next couple decades, most of those declines in species happen during the extended drought periods.
Okay.
And there's a bit
enjoy a little bit of wet. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an interesting, a little bit of an asymmetry there too, where I think that that's absolutely true for ecological systems, where I think that, and it's also the case that we've been farther outside of historical and even last millennium experience when it comes to the dry side. So we really have been pushing ecosystems much farther outside of the dry side of their preferred envelope, their observed envelope, than on the wet side. But interestingly, human systems have almost the opposite sensitivity, where our built infrastructure is actually asymmetrically susceptible to big increases in wet extremes versus dry extremes. So not exclusively so, but it's kind of, on the dry side, there are some real ecological challenges, and on the wet side, there's some real human infrastructural challenges. And there's some additional challenges that arise from the rapid transitions between these things in both types of systems as they increase. So it's a pretty complex picture, but I think it's true that the ecologic sensitivity is really tricky on the dry side, especially.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And what about reservoirs? So many people have asked about reservoirs. What is the future of reservoirs in California? We know that some are being removed that are mostly for hydroelectricity. We have a couple projects that are rather big that are being talked about in the future, more for water capture for human consumption. Are we wasting water, letting it go down these river systems? Is there a way to capture it? What are we thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot, the notion that water that is in rivers is somehow wasted. And also the notion that we need to have more bigger dams in California, right, to capture this increasing variability of the water falling from the sky, right? And I think on a certain level, I understand why a lot of people suggest that as a potential solution. But I think the challenge is that, first of all, it's important to know that almost all of California's major rivers are already dammed in the most optimal place for capturing water in those watersheds. So there are relatively few opportunities for on-stream storage to really improve things. And also, from an infrastructural perspective, I mentioned that our human-built infrastructure starts to really come under increased strain under unusually wet, or especially under unprecedented wet conditions, like the ones we're very likely and progressively more likely to see in the future. In these cases, really big dams can actually become a bit of a liability because you can no longer fill them up safely because you need to maintain ever greater safety margins during big flood events. And they don't really expand your storage potential during the dry events as much as something like groundwater banking might, for example. So taking advantage of natural underground water storage potential. So just from a physical climate and engineering perspective, that's sort of my take on it. Although I think that there are some additional ecological considerations as well that I haven't even mentioned here.
Yeah, and I think building on that, that's why what the Nature Conservancy is focusing on when it comes to California's potential for storing more water. That's why we're really focusing on getting more water in our groundwater basins and increasing both the ability for our landscapes to recharge groundwater, so capture groundwater and percolate it down into the basins, but also be more intentional about recharge projects that almost act like underground dams where we're just pumping water into those basins. There's a lot less of the ecological impacts with those projects. And they also has the added benefit of most of them come with needing to also restore natural landscapes like wetlands and rivers and these things that have benefits for both nature and people. So that's where we're focusing our efforts, is in that piece of the storage question. But again, also, if there are, other for the above ground storage projects that are being proposed and being talked about, the Nature Conservancy's role there is to do exactly what Daniel described, which is to ask questions about how those projects will be able to adapt to a changing climate and how do we make sure they don't add to the biodiversity crisis we're already having.
Okay, thank you. And a lot of the examples that we saw today were about, they were in rural areas with very large river systems. And we love that TNC works at scale. But what about most of us live in suburban areas or very urbanized areas? Does anything really matter about how we're trying to recapture stormwater, or what we can do to make our systems more resilient in these kind of flooding situations and also in the drought? Like, how does that all ladder up?
Daniel, do you want to go first? Or you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I can. So there are, of course, different challenges doing this in more highly populated or urbanized settings than there are in agricultural or rural areas. Essentially, you have more potential options where there's less development, right? You have more opportunities to expand floodplains without displacing people, right? Or major infrastructure. And that's harder in highly populated areas like, say, like Los Angeles County or something like that, where there are historically significant watersheds and major waterways that still exist. It's just that now the cities have sort of enveloped them. Pavement and concrete have sort of enveloped these watersheds. And so there it is difficult to do things on the same scale, but it is nonetheless still possible to find opportunities in different places. There, on the LA River, for example, there have been some nascent flood, but smaller scale, but still important floodplain restoration projects. But there are also other things that aren't even necessarily related to major rivers, but even just in an urban setting, things where you can decrease the fraction of impermeable surface. In other words, get rid of some of the asphalt and the concrete and put in either parks or bioswales, or even if it's replacing storm drains, in some cases, in some places where there's just a little bit of space, even if it's literally 2 or 3 foot margin on the edge of a road, sort of percolation zone for some stormwater to make it into the local aquifer there, rather than immediately entering storm drains and then contributing to runoff. There are opportunities like that all throughout urban areas, but I know there are a couple of specific Nature Conservancy projects also that we might be able to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on the major points, Daniel, which is that in the rural areas, we are able to do these larger scale restoration projects that, we can take up space with. And so in the urban areas, what we're trying to do is look for places and opportunities to demonstrate projects that can be done over and over and over again. And so one example of that is a project we're doing on the LA River. It's called the Bow Tie Project, where we're demonstrating how what is now, but hopefully won't soon be, a fully concrete river bed and river riparian area along the LA River, converting that back to a natural landscape with a real focus on stormwater capture. So the type of water that's rain and water that the LA area is seeing right now, where it's runoff from, streets and people's houses down towards the river, and capturing that. And so our goal there is 2 things. One is to demonstrate how these kind of projects almost pay for themselves in a couple of ways. 1, they reduce flood risk, but 2, they also significantly increase water quality. And down in urban areas, specifically Southern California, there's a lot of costs associated with all of the gunk and goop that comes off of our streets and around our cities and is taken by water out to our rivers and into our oceans. So we're demonstrating that these projects help with water quality. And then we're also demonstrating how they help with the actual natural function of the river. And so I think it's good to just recognize that in places that we have really urbanized a river's kind of corridors, we might not have the same big opportunities, and we probably are not going to fully restore it to its previous function, without, humans just removing themselves, which I don't think is going to be. So we are just kind of reconciling how that landscape can work with ours.
All right, good. Thank you very much. And just going to some of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, how vulnerable are the levees in California from all the rain that we've had, and what's projected? Is there any break in them that could be disastrous for the many people who live near them? So what's the future of levees?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that that is a major, major concern. And there is no easy solution to it because there are thousands of miles of levees and there are very different kinds of levees in California. Some are engineered and designed to high standards in certain urban areas and heavily maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or other various state and federal entities. There are other levees that are essentially just glorified dirt heaps, dirt and rock piles on private land. And that spectrum of susceptibility to flooding, as you might expect, it's the ones that are the oldest and the least maintained that are at the most risk. But frankly, even the major ones that protect urban areas are not guaranteed to, be perfect in an extreme flood scenario like the ones we foresee becoming more likely in a warming climate. So this really is a major challenge. It's one of the reasons why we've developed these arc storm scenarios, is to do some contingency planning and to ask some of these difficult but important what if questions. But I do think, this is going to be a pretty big story moving forward in California. Everybody's aware of the earthquake hazard in California. And after the last decade, I think everybody's acutely aware of the wildfire hazard in California. But this year's events notwithstanding, we haven't had a lot of recent experience with widespread severe flooding in California. And I would argue even after this year, not on the scale that we're talking about and the kinds of things we think are likely in the future. So this is going to be a really important point of conversation at a public policy level and at a local climate adaptation level in the coming decades.
Yeah, and just to add that what our role at the Nature Conservancy is when we're talking about that flood protection infrastructure, just reiterating the role of nature-based solutions in redeveloping our flood infrastructure to be more effective. And so the role of what are known as setback levees, so levees that are farther away from rivers to allow them to roam and to have more space, and the role of wetlands, and those are really important things, not only for floods, but also sea level rise. So that's how we see ourselves playing a role, because there will be many, many conversations and billions of dollars spent on adapting to this changed climate. And our role is to try and do it in the way that is the most effective for both people and nature.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we have another question, and I see more questions rolling in. Thank you so much. We are going to get out of time here. I think we have time for one more question. And this is I think it's a really great one. How can you predict rain when an earmark of climate change is its unpredictability? So you're talking about the pendulum swinging, and we can expect that the pendulum will swing, but
Right.
Is there a way to forecast? Like, we had a La Nina year, but then we had this really amazing amount of rain. So what about weather forecasting? How are we going to be able to predict what's coming?
Well, it's a good question. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, check out my live YouTube office hours. I do sort of interactive public style office hours and address just these kinds of questions there with lengthier responses. But the short version is that weather forecasts come from process-based physical models. And the underlying physics is that it's, of course, it gets more complicated than this, but at its core, it's something as basic as force equals mass times acceleration. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. These fundamental physical laws. And as much as things are changing in a warming climate, those things aren't changing, the fundamental physics and chemistry of the atmosphere. And so our ability to predict the weather isn't obviously going to be degraded even as the climate may become more variable, because the individual weather events still have to obey the laws of physics. It's just that those physics are being applied in an environment where the background conditions are different, and so they allow for different outcomes. So I guess it's good news in a way that I don't think we'll have worse weather forecasts in the future. It's just that those weather forecasts might have to be accommodating just more extreme events. And so if anything, actually, weather forecasts become more important, I think, in the future, because they give us some short-term warning that these kinds of events that we've been talking about, are on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. There is a future for more meteorologists and climate scientists. That is for certain.
That is true.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, everyone that's been participating via chat and just listening. We really, really appreciate your support of the Nature Conservancy and your interest in climate and biodiversity issues and saving our planet on behalf of people and nature. We need you. We are nothing without you. So thank you so much. And we do look forward to seeing you next time at the Future of Forests. That is our next future webinar. And again, if there are other topics you'd like to hear or a little bit deeper dive into these issues, please let us know. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your lunch and your lunch hour, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.